Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, members of the Congress, I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. I urge every member of both parties, Americans of all religions and of all colors, from every section of this country, to join me in that cause. At times, history and fate meet at a single time, in a single place, to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was a century ago at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama. There, long-suffering men and women peacefully protested the denial of their rights as Americans. Many were brutally assaulted. One good man, a man of God, was killed. There is no cause for pride in what has happened in Selma.
Johnson came to the presidency with more than 30 years of Washington experience. His late bid for the Democratic presidential nomination in the summer of 1960 failed to stop Kennedy's momentum, but it persuaded Kennedy to offer him the VP nomination. Johnson helped Kennedy carry Texas and therefore win the presidency in 1960. On November 22, 1963, Johnson was sworn in as president aboard Air Force One as Jacqueline Kennedy, her clothes stained with her husband's blood, stood by his side. In the days immediately following the assassination, Johnson implored Kennedy's top aides to remain. They did so out of a sense of duty, but most left over the next 18 months, unable to overcome their grief and sensed that Johnson was an unworthy successor to their hero. Almost immediately, President Johnson expressed impatience with America's racial injustice. He told a grieving Congress the day before Thanksgiving, 1963, that, quote, "We have talked long enough in this country about equal rights. We have talked for 100 years or more," end quote. Johnson's addresses to Congress in 1963 and 1964 called on the country and lawmakers to enact Kennedy's unfinished agenda. He emphasized the need to eliminate the blight of poverty. He declared unconditional war on poverty in America. Johnson threw himself into the struggle to enact the civil rights law Kennedy had introduced in the summer of 1963. In the first 6 months of 1964, he pleaded with and badgered members of Congress to pass the law. He overcame the inclination of some Republican senators to join with Southern Democrats to filibuster the bill when he told Everett Dirksen, the Republican Senate leader, that the party of Abraham Lincoln could not be seen as standing in the way of civil rights. In July, Johnson signed the most sweeping civil rights law since Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It outlawed segregation in restaurants, overnight accommodations, and transportation. It created a Fair Employment Practices Commission that could sue to guarantee equal opportunity in hiring and promotion in private firms with more than 99 employees. The law gave the Justice Department the power to file a suit when a person's civil rights were violated. The law also outlawed discrimination on the basis of sex as well as race. Enactment of the Civil Rights Acts occurred as the presidential election campaign got underway. Johnson easily defeated the Republican candidate, Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. The president carried every state with the exception of Goldwater's Arizona and 5 states in the old Confederacy. On election night, it appeared as if Johnson and the Democrats had cemented a durable majority in favor of political liberalism and an active federal government. Despite the size of Johnson's victory, however, there were ominous signs for the future of the Democrats as the majority party and portents of hope for Republicans. Goldwater's nomination represented the triumph of newly assertive conservatism. Unlike the Republican presidential nominees from 1940 to 1960, who had endorsed the idea of a federal government that would take responsibility for the country's economic and social well-being, Goldwater and his supporters considered the federal government an adversary of personal liberty. One of Goldwater's backers, Ronald Reagan, spoke on his behalf a week before the election. He said he had long been a Democrat, but now was a Republican because Goldwater opposed Johnson's expansion of government programs. After the election, to Reagan's dismay, Johnson pressed forward with voting rights laws. In the spring of 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. and SNCC led demonstrations in Selma, Alabama, to demand the right to vote. 15,000 voting-age African Americans lived in Selma, but only 355 were registered voters. Would-be African American voters faced the prospect of losing their jobs or homes or even their lives if they applied to vote. More than 3,000 demonstrators demanding the right to vote were arrested in January and February 1965. Sheriff's deputies knocked a woman to the ground and signed the skin of demonstrators with electric cattle prods. In response to the brutality, King and John Lewis of SNCC planned a 56-mile march from Selma to Birmingham, Alabama. On Sunday, March 7th, with TV crews filming, 600 demonstrators assembled at the Edmund Pettus Bridge at the edge of Selma, where they faced dozens of sheriff deputies. Sheriff Jim Clark gave the demonstrators 2 minutes to disperse before ordering horse-mounted deputies into the crowd. They fired tear gas and swung bullwhips and rubber tubes wrapped with barbed wire at demonstrators. In the summer of 1965, Congress responded to the widespread public revulsion at the displays of racism by enacting the Voting Rights Act. Under its terms, which outlawed literacy tests to vote, the Justice Department had the power directly to register voters in districts where discrimination existed. Over the next 3 years, registration rates for African Americans rose from 31% to 57%, although still lower than the 71% of whites registered to vote. Over the next 4 decades, African Americans won elections at all levels. Passage of the Voting Rights Act also deepened the racial divide between the major parties. Newly registered African American voters overwhelmingly voted for the Democratic Party candidates. In the Deep South, white voters increasingly voted Republican rather than Democratic. From the 1980s to the early 21st century, southern states became the most heavily Republican region of the country.
Those who would trade our freedom for the soup kitchen of the welfare state have told us they have a utopian solution of peace without victory. They call their policy accommodation. And they say if we'll only avoid any direct confrontation with the enemy, he'll forget his evil ways and learn to love us. All who oppose them are indicted as warmongers. They say we offer simple answers to complex problems. Well, perhaps there is a simple answer. Not an easy answer, but simple. If you and I have the courage to tell our elected officials that we want our national policy based on what we know in our hearts is morally right, we cannot buy our security, our freedom from the threat of the bomb, by committing an immorality so great as saying to 1 billion human beings now enslaved behind the Iron Curtain, give up your dreams of freedom, because to save our own skins, we're willing to make a deal with your slave masters.
Your imagination and your initiative and your indignation will determine whether we build a society where progress is the servant of our needs, or a society where old values and new visions are buried under unbridled growth. For in your time, we have the opportunity to move not only toward the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the great society. The great society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we're totally committed in our time.
In 1965 and 1966, Congress enacted a wide array of programs designed directly to eliminate poverty. It created the Office of Economic Opportunity, headed by Sergeant Shriver, the first director of the Peace Corps, to supervise the war on poverty. The Job Corps, modeled on the Civilian Conservation Corps of the New Deal, employed 100,000 poor young men and women during its first 8 years. Volunteers in Service to America, otherwise known as VISTA, patterned on the Peace Corps, recruited people to work in poverty-stricken areas in the U.S. An ambitious Model Cities program was designed to encourage physical and economic revitalization of the nation's poorest urban areas. However, infighting among local and federal officials and lack of funds caused by the growing Vietnam War hampered its success. Congress created the Cabinet Department of Transportation and Department of Housing and Urban Development to oversee programs to improve urban life. Great Society programs also address the quality of life of middle-income and wealthy Americans. The National Foundation for the Arts and Humanities, patterned on the larger National Science Foundation created in 1950, provided federal grants to individuals and institutions such as universities, museums, theaters, orchestras, and ballet companies. Congress created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which provided funds for notable television series such as Sesame Street, Nova, and The American Experience. In 1965, Congress ended the national quota system for immigration in place since the 1920s. After World War II, advocates for refugees denounced the quota system for denying Jews entry into the U.S. before the war, a stance that led to the eventual murder of millions. Nevertheless, in 1952, in the midst of fears of communism, Congress passed, over President Truman's veto, an immigration law that retained the quotas and added restriction on the entry of political radicals. The 1965 immigration law replaced that system and allowed 170,000 immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere and 120,000 from the Western Hemisphere to enter the U.S. each year. When Johnson signed the bill, he said it ends, quote, "the harsh injustice of the national origins quota system, which was a cruel and enduring wrong," end quote. Great Society reforms were popular at first, but enthusiasm faded in the last 2 years of Johnson's presidency. African-American uprisings against police brutality, poverty, and continuing racial discrimination in major cities left dozens dead at the hands of police and National Guard units sent in by governors to quell the violence. Nearly all of the dead were African Americans. The scenes of burning stores and sounds of gunshots and police sirens, all of which played endlessly on television news, alarmed many whites. They expressed this so-called white backlash by rejecting the Great Society and voting for Republican candidates who promised to restore law and order. Republican candidates successfully replaced Democratic majorities in the congressional election of 1966. During the rest of his term, Johnson was able to persuade Congress to pass only one more major piece of social reform legislation,